From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
I tend to look at the readers' comments under my articles, and something I'd noticed in the last year or so were people asking for more context, and sometimes it can be quite difficult to give that in a 550-word news story.
For David Woode, The Times crime correspondent, reporting on knife crime is a big part of the job.
Last year particularly, I spent a lot of time covering kids who have been stabbed to death by other kids.
Your reader comments got David thinking about whether he could take all of the cases he was reporting on and see if there were any patterns.
We tend to have an idea of what we think knife crime is in this country and who are the perpetrators and who are the victims. And I just started thinking, who's carrying knives? Who are the victims? And that was my starting point.
For months, David, along with colleagues at The Times, has been digging into millions of lines of data, and they can now reveal the true scale of knife crime here in England and Wales. In the past decade, deaths from stabbings, knife robberies and possession have all gone up. And the capital is facing its own unique challenges as Black Londoners are disproportionately being affected by knife crime.
Black people accounted for 53% of the people stabbed to death in London in 2023. And black males aged 16 to 24 represented a third of all black victims.
As part of the project, David sat down with the head of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark Rowley, for an exclusive interview.
I don't see a collective effort to get around the table. I think because it overlays with race, I think it's just a harder conversation to have.
The story today: what's behind the rise in knife crime?
I'm David Woode, and I'm the crime correspondent for The Times.
David, as crime correspondent, you've been looking into knife crime and the whole world around it, really. Along the way, you came across a man called Charles Oppong. Tell me a bit about him.
Charles Oppong was 18 years old when I met him. He was an aspiring project manager. He was a really smart, astute, articulate young man, and he was telling me about growing up in South London.
Being in South London where gang crime used to be quite high, I feel like it's important for everyone to remember that at the end of the day, we're all human beings.
He talked to me about how there's a real problem with youth violence and knife crime.
If you are attacked in the street for whatever reason, you're going to wish that somebody came over to help you.
We'd met in the basement of Bishopsgate police station because he was there attending a workshop with firearms officers who were teaching young people how to stem a catastrophic wound.
Now, when you see a catastrophic bleed, generally you'll probably notice it straight away because it will be jettisoning out, or it will be a huge amount of blood, bright red blood, not the dark blood.
The session was led by PC Liam Masterton. He, when I arrived, was crouched next to a bloodied crush test dummy, and it was in a recovery position. And he had asked the students to imagine that they were at the scene of a stabbing of a teenager outside a train station.
So you've got your chappie, he's bleeding. We've got someone else who has put pressure on. One of you's coming along with a tourniquet. They will come. You lift yours up, please, sir.
There were all the equipment that you would need to help prolong this person's life. And so he was surrounded by a tourniquet and invented chest seals and scissors and blue rubber gloves.
What has happened is we've had a stab wound here. It's been applied. A ball was dangling here, was pulled into tourniquet and was tightened and popped. So
these bleed control kits are not just in London, they're in public places and public buildings all around the country.
And David, you went to look at this workshop as part of a big project on knife crime. Just tell us what you've been looking at and how you went about sort of getting a bigger picture in terms of data.
I spoke to our Home Affairs editor, Matt Dathan, and we went to the Home Office. And eventually, in end of August, I received a file of 4.7 million lines of data
Wow.
relating to perpetrators and to victims. The data stretches between January 2013 and December 2023. 43 police forces in England and Wales. We have ages, ethnicity, gender. It really focuses on fatal knife victims and people who have been sentenced for possessing a knife or sharp instrument.
And with 4.7 million lines of data, that starts to sound like a pretty epic project.
And I've got to say a big thank you to my colleague George Willoughby, who's the data journalist at the Times. He had the unenviable task of breaking it down, working up formulas. I remember him telling me he had to, the programs that they have, they couldn't penetrate it, so they had to kind of build something to break it down. And we were then able to say, right, we can now look at who are the victims and who are the perpetrators. And once we did that, we were then able to start finding the stories.
And just standing back, it feels like we hear a lot more about knife crime at the moment.
This evening, a 14-year-old boy has died after being stabbed on a double-decker bus in southeast London.
The woman who died following that stabbing incident in Manchester.
The 18-year-old was stabbed 4 times in front of shoppers and children in the middle of Ipswich.
Just on a national level, what has happened to knife crime?
So knife homicides overall over the last decade increased by 23%, while knife-related robberies have surged 59% over the last decade.
And is that sort of shoplifting, muggings?
Pretty much. And also it's, even when a knife isn't used, but it's present, that's still logged as a knife-enabled offence.
If there's the threat of the use. So you've got a situation where you've got incidents are clearly going up all over the place. Mm-hmm. For this story, you managed to get an exclusive interview with Sir Mark Rowley. I mean, just remind us of who he is.
Sir Mark Rowley is the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police.
Thanks for time. No problem. Thanks for patience. No, not at all. No. This is important stuff. This matters.
Why did he think knife crime was rising?
So we spoke specifically about London, although he was aware of the data nationwide. If we were to start off, how acute is the problem of knife crime facing Londoners at the moment?
There's different parts of the knife crime problem. We've spoken publicly about sort of street robbery, which is very different in London. It's linked not just to, it's linked to having a big transient population. It's linked to the marketplace now for stolen Samsung and Apple phones.
He said in London, gang violence and robberies of smartphones and this kind of booming marketplace for stolen handsets is creating an uptick in knife crime. And he said something that was really quite stark. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And he said, if I was to take you to a late shift briefing anywhere in London and you asked officers,
okay, how many of you have come back to the police station on a shift in the last year sort of covered in blood because you've been trying to stop a teenager bleeding out?
How many of you in the last year have come back to the police station at the end of your shift, covered in blood, because you've tried to stop a young person from bleeding out
Wow.
on the street. He said,
You'd have the majority of hands that go up.
the majority of hands would go up.
Some are more able to compartmentalise than others, or some are able to compartmentalise and then it's a kid who's the same age as their kid or something that really hits them.
You know, as reporters, you want to cover as much as you can, but we don't have the resources to cover every stabbing incident, every knife attack, and that's just in London. You've got Hampshire, you've got Greater Manchester, you've got West Yorkshire, Merseyside, I could go on.
And in terms of London, you're talking to the commander of the Metropolitan Police. What had you found by then in terms of the data? What were you finding in terms of the knife crime that was happening in London? Who were the perpetrators and who were the victims?
So the Met had logged the most number of knife deaths, 739 out of 2,574 in the 10 years to December 2023. And black people made up 49% of the capital's fatal stab victims. Now, that to me is alarming, considering black Londoners make up 14% of the capital's population.
Wow, so really disproportionately being affected more by knife crime.
And so when you look at the perpetrators sentenced for carrying knives during that decade, 45% of those were black. When we dug into the data, people aged between 18 and 20 made up the majority of offenders who were sentenced for possessing a knife in 2023, which is at odds with the 30 to 39 age group, which represented the bulk of those sentenced for having a knife at every single force around the country.
Around the country, yeah. So it's much younger, much more predominantly black. Different picture in London.
When compared to every other force in England and Wales.
And it's interesting that they're so young because you were told how so many police officers come back at the end of a shift covered in blood. You started by telling us about this workshop you went to. This is clearly something that young people are worried they are going to encounter at some point.
Yeah, and I think that's a sad thing for me because, you know, I didn't grow up in London, but I came to London at the age of 18 and, you know, it wasn't something I discussed with my friends at the time. And the drivers of these offences has completely changed from when I was that age. Social media has a role to play in this, the access of knives and how knives are becoming larger and more terrifying. You find as well when you cover these cases, especially if you're out on the doors or you're out at the scene when an incident like a stabbing has been reported, there'll always be mobile phone footage knocking about.
Mama's got a samurai, bro.
Sometimes you'll see it like on social media platforms, like within minutes of the attack. And, you know, these are children are witnessing their peers being stabbed in front of their very eyes. That's not normal.
No, it shouldn't be.
One of the things I was quite keen to dig into and see if I could find was how easy is it for a perpetrator to become a victim? And 59% of the 51 teenagers stabbed to death in London in the 3 years to April 2024 were previously suspected of offences involving knives. And to me, that just illustrates this kind of revolving door of victims and criminality.
So people who pick up a knife are more likely to die by a knife.
Sadly. But it's also worth remembering that 99% of people do not carry knives. But for me, I'm always wanting to know what are the drivers for that 1% who feel they can't leave their house without a blade.
And did Sir Mark Rowley have any thoughts on that? What's driving people to feel like they can't go out without a knife?
He talked about how the drug market and gang violence is driving knife crime in the capital. He said how his detectives are routinely smashing, drug networks and mapping the phone lines of who is transporting the drugs to which counties around the country.
Sadly, too often it's sort of young black lads being coerced and drawn into that and then almost indoctrinated when they're 13, 14 in a life of criminality.
And he said, we're going after the organisers.
The vast majority of people we're arresting for running the lines have a long track record of violence. Many of them have been arrested for sort of stabbings or murders.
And they're driving this, and that's the challenge for him. But then he also knows that the Met has a checkered history with black Londoners.
Some of the community meetings I've been to over the last 2 years as Commissioner, some of them very raw, where you've got people who've lost loved ones or friends or whatever in the room.
Over-policing and feelings of under-protection in some parts of London has manifested in distrust.
There's two things that I get. One is, we don't like the way you police. The second one is, we want more policing. We're losing too many of our young people.
Police officers have told me they'll be called to a stabbing and it might involve a young black boy, and people won't want to talk to them because of this long-held distrust.
So rebuilding trust is clearly a key problem. It's something the police need to do quite quickly if they want to be able to do something about knife crime. They need to work out, and the community too, they need to work in conjunction to work out how they can best help each other. You also have, is it resources? Because, looking at the data that you've come up with, if you can see that so many of the victims of knife crime are also the ones who've in the past been found with knives, you'd sort of think there would be something quite targeted.
You mean stop and search?
Well, is that the answer?
So that came up during the interview because in August last year, the Policing Inspectorate published a report into the Met. And in that report, it said how officers aren't comfortable doing a stop and search because if an interaction goes wrong, it could lead to a complaint, and that complaint could derail their career for 2 years. It could lead to misconduct proceedings, could even lead to criminal charges. But I know when I looked at the HMIC report, it said that officers aren't confident using the police stop and search.
Yeah.
So is the Met struggling to take weapons off the streets if officers don't feel confident using the power?
It is having an effect, yes, because the confidence and use of power becomes... So this is where you get into this real tension. We have sometimes misused our powers in the past, and there are some high-profile cases to that effect, and that's clear.
Well, he acknowledged that forces sometimes misuse their powers.
Most officers go out every day to do their job with good intent.
But most officers go out every day with good intent.
The policing's job is to operate where society starts to fracture, isn't it? When things start to go wrong, that's our job. We're at that point of conflict, that point of tension. So it's always going to be contentious to step into the middle of that.
But he took aim at the police complaints system.
We have the unusual situation in the UK where if you're a police officer and I'm on a bike, or in a car, if you're pursuing me, if I do something stupid, you're then held to account for that.
He said that there needs to be more of a, quote, collective effort from ministers and the Mayor of London's office, educators, charities, the medical profession, like the NHS, to get around a table and try and tackle this head on in a practical way.
And I'm not a sociologist or even a criminologist. I'm a police officer, and I can see what's landing in our lap to deal with, which is sort of tragic victimisation within disproportionately affecting black communities. And I don't see a collective effort to get around the table. I think because it overlays with race, I think it's just a harder conversation to have.
So, David, you've looked at knife crime across the UK. We've talked quite a lot about London, but where is the crime capital when it comes to knife possession? Because it's a slightly more complicated and unexpected picture.
Yeah, so when we were digging through the data, we started applying population data to it to see how that would affect it. And so when we did that, we found that Cleveland had the highest rate of people sentenced for knife possession per 100,000 people.
So for people who are just trying to imagine the map of where this is all happening, what are the areas that Cleveland Police cover?
So it's in the northeast of England, a small force area which covers towns such as Hartlepool, Middlesbrough, Redcar and Stockton.
And what do you find in terms of who is carrying a knife in those areas? You know, in the way that you were able to break it down for London and it was sort of young black people mainly. What are you seeing in Cleveland?
97% of people sentenced for knife possession in Cleveland were white over the last decade, and the majority were aged between 25 and 34.
So a little bit older.
A little bit older, and 26 out of the 28 fatal stabbing victims were white.
Do we know why that's happening in the Northeast?
So my colleague Constance Kampfner, she's the Times' Northern correspondent.
Hello.
You okay?
Yeah, good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you.
Spoke to Richard Baker, who's the Assistant Chief Constable of Cleveland. He said, in the 70s and 80s, the area was thriving. You had the steel industry and the ports were busy.
People will talk about the fact that, the markets locally were bustling on a weekend, and people always had money in their pockets. People, their kids always had a job that they could walk into. And for generation after generation, you had those opportunities up here.
But the closure meant that families were hit hard. People were out of work.
And as a result of that, it's become very socially deprived area, low educational attainment.
You've got some families for which crime is cyclical. It passes through generations.
The family names up here have gone through generations of, criminality and that sort of, they all know each other. So there's not a huge amount of movement in and out of the area.
He said there was an absence of hope in some respects.
Yeah.
And he said something very interesting. He said how the reporting of knife crime can sometimes be skewed to London, and it doesn't always represent the issues that they're facing. It's really important to stress that the demographics of gangs and criminality, it's so different around the country. The offences are the same, but why people do it differs around parts of the country.
In London, where you will have seen it, and a few other areas, county lines is a really big factor with a lot of this. We get very little county lines up here, but we do have very localised drug models.
Their demographic is very, very different to London. It's predominantly white people who live in the area, whereas in London, I think 40% of London is non-white, according to the last census data. And so the challenges in terms of diverse communities that just don't exist there, he said it kind of skews the general public's view on knife crime. And, that's something other youth workers and policy experts have told me since reporting on this story.
Do you think there's a danger that, we hear these headlines all the time, that we sort of start to normalise knife crime as something that happens to other people?
Yeah. It's something Sir Mark Rowley mentioned to me during our interview.
The idea of a 15-year-old kid bleeding out in the street is horrific, isn't it? My son's grew up in London. That should upset anybody. And somehow I worry it's sort of it's at risk of being normalised because, well, that's gang crime. That doesn't affect ordinary people or whatever. I worry it just gets put in a box.
You want to be telling these stories. There's just not enough. There's not enough newsprint. And that's what it feels like. We're recording this at the start of January, and Already I've seen notifications on my phone about a stabbing in Brixton, a stabbing in Eastbourne, a stabbing in Birmingham. It's almost like whack-a-mole, in a way. Take 10 knives off the street, 20 more pop up. Stop and search 15 kids and you take a knife off them, then 30 more arm themselves. And I just think, as a reporter, I see it manifesting itself through the courts. And it always hits home when you have to listen to the victim impact statements of parents who will describe how their son left for school in the morning and then he never came home. They got a telephone call at work and said that he'd been stabbed outside school and he'd bled to death on the pavement. I'm not naive in thinking that these cases will stop overnight with legislation. I know that's not going to happen. But you want to be able to spotlight the campaigners and the charities and the support groups who are doing this work to raise awareness of criminal exploitation or county lines and all those kind of things that are driving knife crime. But also as well, there's onus on young people to ask themselves, if I am walking out of my house with a knife, is it worth it?
That was David Woode, crime correspondent at The Times. Today, we've only covered a fraction of David and The Times team's extensive report, but you can read it all at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producer today was Sam Chantarasak, the executive producer was Will Rowe, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If there's a story you'd like us to look into, or if you'd like to get in touch about anything you've heard, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. And if you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.